Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Channa Prakash. He is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Tuskegee University. His research expertise is on genetic improvement of food crops that are of importance to developing countries and training of scientists and students in plant biotechnology. Dr. Prakash has also been actively involved in enhancing the societal awareness of food biotechnology issues around the world. And today we're talking about gene editing techniques in plants, GMOs more generally, organic agriculture, and some of the behavior of activists in regards to environmentalism and agriculture more specifically. So, Dr. Prakash, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm honored to be here.
So let's start with your work on gene editing techniques in plants. So tell us a little bit about what you do there, and perhaps for the audience to start with, perhaps many people are not familiar with what gene editing actually is. So perhaps please start there and explain a little bit what these techniques are really about.
Thank you so much. Many of you, your audience around the world, especially in Europe, are very familiar with GMOs or genetically modified organisms. It's a very controversial topic. Many genetically modified crops are by and large are not allowed to be grown by European farmers, although Europe imports a lot of genetically modified foodstuff, especially for the livestock feed. But nevertheless, there is a new and better, more precise technique that has come about in the last few years, and that is called gene editing. The difference between GMO and gene editing is very simple. GMOs involve introduction of foreign genes into an organism. So when you take, say, a gene from potato and put it into tomato, that's a GMO. But gene editing is essentially changing the few letters in the alphabet of the DNA of within the organism without necessarily introducing foreign genes. That is genome editing or gene editing. It's a very revolutionary new technique called CRISPR, CRISPR, that was invented, co-invented by a scientist from Europe and a scientist from the United States. They both women who got the Nobel Prize 3 years ago for their invention. It's radically transforming the whole area of genetic alteration, especially in the biomedical area. And that involves gene editing, CRISPR. The way to, a good analogy to say that is like if you're typing something on your phone and it does an autocorrection and corrects your spelling mistakes. And that's what we do with gene editing to correct some of the spelling mistakes in the DNA. And by doing so, we could introduce subtle but significant changes in the crop plants.
Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the results we can get, are there big differences between using more conventional techniques that we use with genetically modified organisms and, on the other hand, using gene editing? Because I know, and we're going to get into that in a bit, that there's many myths and misconceptions surrounding GMOs, and that's probably where most of the controversy stems from, right? But in this particular case, since people, even though they might be mistaken or misled, have these ideas surrounding GMOs, do you think that perhaps they shouldn't be as worried when it comes to gene editing techniques, or?
Right. As far as science is concerned, we have been growing GMOs for the past 30 years, and we have not had a single instance of harm to the human health or the livestock health or even an environmental mishap. We have not had that. But nevertheless, it remains controversial, primarily because the perception that we are putting something foreign into your food, and also because of orchestrated opposition to this technology. And so the consumer's mind, especially in Europe, has really been very much opposed to the concept of GMOs. But on the other hand, gene editing is not much different from what we have been doing in changing our crop plants or even livestock for hundreds or even thousands of years. You see, every crop plant that you grow today around the world, including everything that you grow there in Europe, all those crops have been altered over 10,000 years when we started experimenting with agriculture. You see, we started growing food plants by essentially growing wild crops, and a lot of those wild crops were unfit for agriculture, and we started selecting those that could be grown with less toxins, and they don't shatter, and that are easier to cook and things like that. And so over a period of time, all our crop plants have been radically altered to suit the way that could be conveniently grown, conveniently cooked, and they're nutritious, they are not, don't have toxins in the food, things of that nature. And the last 100 years, we have done that in more scientific manner, using hybridization, using the principles of genetics. And one of the most important tools that we have used is called mutagenesis. We have taken the seeds and expose them to radiation, expose them to chemicals to bring about changes or mutations. If there is no particular trait in the crop germplasm, we introduce that artificially. And so people, farmers, and scientists have been bringing about changes in your food crops and livestock for a long time. And this gene editing represents one of the most newer techniques, the one that is more precise, one that is knowledge driven, and for which we have much greater understanding. And we recognize it's far more superior and safer than any of the other techniques that we have used in making those changes. And why do we need to be messing with our food? Why do we need gene editing? Is an important question, and it is because we still need to feed 8 or 9 billion people, and there's a lot of challenges to agriculture, especially with the global climate change, and we need all the tools in our toolbox, and gene editing represents one of the most important and powerful tools that we have.
And so what would you say are the main goals of using gene editing in plants specifically? Are you trying to alter or improve certain specific traits, and in what contexts, what circumstances exactly?
Yes, gene editing, because it involves fine changes of just few nucleotides in the DNA, is best suited for changing simple traits. Traits like making our plants more resistant to diseases, for instance. Just now, a British scientist have introduced tomatoes that are purple in color. They almost look like blueberries. And this is now for the first time in the United States here. We as home gardeners can go buy those tomato seeds and grow those tomato in our backyard. Why do we want purple tomatoes? Those purple tomatoes, apparently, they introduced a gene from an edible snapdragon, the snapdragon flowers that you may be familiar with, that are very blue color flowers. Yes. And they've introduced that into tomato because they have very high healthy compounds called anthocyanins that are apparently good for our health. And so gene editing is very useful in making small changes, in deleting characters, such as if there are certain foods with high undesirable elements, like, we have cyanide in cassava, we have anti-nutritional factors in some of the grain legumes that we eat. So we can remove those undesirable elements from our food. But most importantly, gene editing has proved very useful in empowering our crop plants to be more resilient to certain environmental factors. We can make them crops more resistant to temperature, with increasing global climate change. That is one. There are examples of the scientists have improved the crops more tolerant to flooding and tolerant to drought conditions, tolerant to salt. And there's really no limit on what we can do with gene editing, especially with simple traits. Even complex traits such as yield increasing yield has been achieved by by editing several genes so that tomatoes can be a larger size, and the rice, we could produce more rice per unit area using less water. And so almost all areas of farming can be altered and improved using this technique.
And so when it comes to tackling the effects of climate change specifically, is it that what we are interested in here mostly is in developing temperature resilient plants, or are there other environmental issues like, for example, droughts and floods that we might also help tackle here by developing certain specific traits in plants?
Absolutely. If you look around the literature and what scientists have achieved, I'm an editor-in-chief of a very prominent journal in this area called GM Crops and Food. And so I tend to almost on a daily basis come across examples of where scientists have developed crops, plants that are more tolerant to environmental stresses, such as salinity, because increasing salt is one of the problems of sea level increase, encroaching of cultivated land with the sea, and increased use of flooding water in rice and fertilizers have made a lot of our plants, a lot of our soils alkaline, so we can improve tolerance to salinity. Even acidity is a problem in some areas, and of course temperature, flooding, and drought are the most important traits that crops have been altered using gene editing. And another very interesting research that's going on is, as you can see, one of the reasons why we have global climate change is because of the increased carbon dioxide. And so scientists are specifically developing trees and fast-growing grasses that can capture more carbon. So that's called carbon sequestration. So they're able to literally trap carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere and reduce the carbon dioxide surrounding those crop areas. And these are kind of a newer, more frontier areas of research that we could do using gene editing. And there's a company here in the United States, I think, which is also Israel-based company, which is literally trying to develop rice crops that can be grown in the sea. And so just imagine, in 2/3 of our earth is covered by sea, and we cannot grow any food crops on that. But if we are able to grow rice or any other crop on the ocean, and that is going to be a really game changer when it comes to feeding the world.
Yes. And so, I mean, what would you say are perhaps some of the biggest challenges in developing these plants that are the result of gene editing techniques?
Well, the challenges are twofold. One, that is technical. We need to have a greater understanding of the genomics, the underlying genes. We need to know what kind of genes control what kind of traits. And we have a very explosion of knowledge going on, and not only in the genetics of many of these, but what we call as proteomics, how the genes encode for proteins, what kind of proteins, and then we have metabolomics, what kind of metabolites that they secrete. And so concomitant with increase in our knowledge or explosion of genomics, there's also, as you know, a tremendous knowledge increase, applications in artificial intelligence, computational power. All of that is helping our understanding of the basic biology of croplands. And that is important. While we have a good understanding of crops that are grown in the West, such as like maize or soybean, we do not necessarily have such an understanding of many of the crops that are grown in the developing world, such as sweet potato or cassava or bananas. And so that is one limitation. Crops that need to be improved in the developing world, in the tropical areas, need more attention, need more funding. And that is one limitation that is being overcome, and it's just a matter of time. And secondly, is the public acceptance and the global policies enabled at where these gene-edited crops can be tested and can be commercially released. While countries such as United States and even country like India now have a very enabling policy where they say that, hey, if you have developed a crop by gene editing, and if it doesn't involve any foreign genes introduced as a consequence of that, then you could more or less treat it like a conventionally bred crops and don't have to go through a huge regulatory approval process that what is involved for the GM. And that way, many of these generated crops, especially by the public sector, the universities, which don't necessarily have a huge budget to get regulatory approvals, can bring such crops, mainly again in the emerging economies and the developing countries. But Europe is still sitting on the fence. Today, there is a very important decision that the European Union is looking at, and the members of the parliament are going to be voting to see if, just like all other countries, including United States, Japan, and Australia, can European Union also allow gene-edited crops to be regulated as conventionally bred crops and do not have to go through the GMO road. And so let's hope Europe come to its senses and vote favorably.
We'll come back to that certainly in a bit. But you mentioned earlier that the potential of gene editing techniques applied to plants is virtually limitless. So would that mean that, for example, in regards to what we talked about a few minutes ago, since we have a very wide variety of crops across the globe, that it could potentially apply to virtually all crops and be perhaps tailored in each specific crop to each specific environmental context? So let's say with climate change, if temperatures go up in a particular place, perhaps in that particular place for that particular crop, we could edit genes in a way to make the plant more temperature resilient, or if there's more floods in a particular place or droughts, we could also perhaps tweak with some genes to make the specific plants more resilient to those kinds of events. Is that it?
Yeah, absolutely. There is no limit on what crops can be altered, what crop traits can be altered. We are only limited by our knowledge, and the knowledge is improving and extending. And there are, there are going to be certain limitations. For instance, so far, I have not seen very good examples of gene editing trying to improve the pest resistance of crops. Because gene editing can only bring about changes on what DNA it has and what traits that are there and what traits that are either suppressed or when that could be unleashed that are hidden. But on the other hand, currently, much of our crops that are pest resistant is because of a technology called BT. It comes from a bacterial gene from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, and that's what protects our cotton against cotton shoot borer and things of that nature. And corn, many of those crops have BT genes there. But at this moment, gene editing, except in few instances, has not been very useful for pest resistance. But nevertheless, other than that, especially for quality traits, gene editing has proved really, really useful. And over time, I am sure for practically any trait in any crop, as long as there is DNA, if we can study them, we can change them.
So let me ask you a general question about GMOs, and I want to address this question because it is extremely common and there's many, many misconceptions surrounding it. So you mentioned earlier, for example, when it comes to potential health issues that we have now 30 plus years of assessing the potential effects that GMOs could have on human health, particularly. And I mean, I've seen even open letters written by or signed by hundreds of scientists, sometimes even Nobel Prize winners, saying that there's no evidence at all that should make people worry about potential health risks here. But apart from that, would you say that there are any legitimate worries at all about the development of GMOs?
No, not really, because it doesn't mean that some problem would not arise in the future, but it is not unique to GMOs. You see, we have had some problems even with conventional plant breeding. For instance, a celery variety was developed in California a few years ago when workers were who were working with those, but only that particular variety started developing rashes. And they found out that celery, because they had made it more pest resistant, and so they had increased a particular chemical, naturally producing chemical, and this was by conventional breeding. And so we had to take that celery variety away from cultivation. And so things like that can happen even while developing GMOs. For instance, there was a study that 20 years ago, a company had borrowed genes from Brazil nut and put it into soybeans, trying to make it more with high protein and better protein quality. Certain types of amino acids are not found in soybeans, sulfur-containing some amino acids that are important for livestock feeding. And so they got sulfur-containing amino acid type of protein genes from Brazil nut and put it into protein. And then in that protein, in soybeans, they found that it increased the allergenicity of those soybeans, because some people are allergic to Brazil nut. So if you have a peanut allergy or groundnut allergy, and if I take a gene from groundnut and put it into rice or tomato, you may increase that allergy. So what I'm trying to say here is, it's not that we're not going to have any problems with GMOs. What we have is we have sufficient checks and balances, the kind of testing that we have. And because it is so knowledge driven, we could a priori, even before conducting many of these experiments, we can expect potential problems with certain types of GMOs and we can avoid it. But on the other hand, look at the tremendous benefits and the possibilities. Right now, we have research going on trying to develop hypoallergenic groundnuts or peanuts, hypoallergenic soybean, and bananas that can produce vitamin A, and golden rice, which can, of course, help with the vitamin A. And so when you look at all the potential positive health benefits of GMOs and gene editing, some of the hypothetical problems that can happen are very minuscule, and they could be predicted and can be avoided. And they're not unique, because you can have the same allergy problem if you just cross a wild tomato with a cultivated tomato by a traditional breeding. You could bring many of the allergens and toxins from the wild species into the cultivated. So even environmental problems you can introduce even by conventional breeding.
And isn't it also the case that when people argue, for example, that by using gene modification techniques, or even perhaps some of them would argue the same for gene editing specifically, that we are sort of messing with nature because we are introducing certain types of genes where they wouldn't be naturally found? Isn't it the case that we have actually been doing that, but not with this level of knowledge and precision since we started agriculture 10,000 years or 13,000 years ago, with both plants and animals through artificial selection, but without any control at all when it comes to the genetic material, and also with techniques like hybridization?
Yeah, absolutely. You see, we have been doing it for a long time. And so it's not something new that we are messing with the nature. We started messing with the nature when we walked out of the caves and started planting seeds. And when we found out some of those seeds were not very good, we started, looking for a better crops within that. And that's how the whole selection process slowly occurred. And so it is a responsible way of trying to manipulate what is around us in a way that could help feed the humanity, but doing so in a manner that is sustainable, because we do recognize that agriculture, feeding 8 billion people on this planet entails some environmental damage, correct? We have cleared massive amounts of forest lands to grow these crops, thousands of years ago, or even still doing it in many parts of the world, and that is undesirable. And secondly, we use a lot of chemicals, fertilizers and pesticides, and we use a lot of heavy equipment that causes damage to the soil. And so the question is not if we are messing with the nature or not. Okay, I think that's irrelevant, because we already, we are doing that in a very big way and for many thousands of years. But moving forward, the question is, how can we continue to feed the humanity, but in a manner that is less damaging to the environment, less damaging to soil, less damaging to the air, and less damaging to water, and to make sure that ability to grow food today does not compromise the ability for our future generations to be growing food. And so when you answer that question, the sustainability can be achieved through knowledge, through science, not through ideology. People say organic farming. A lot of that is just not, the scientifically, it does not show that when you just have organic crops that are sustainable. But I do believe using technologies such as gene editing, combined with all other principles of sustainability, would help us to move forward, to continue to feed the humanity in a responsible manner and in a sustainable manner.
So where do you think these misconceptions that people have surrounding GMOs stem from? And particularly, why is it that people here, where I live in the European Union, seem to be particularly worried about it? Do you think that it stems perhaps mostly from the fact that some people have been putting out some misconceptions out there on the internet and elsewhere, and then people get across them, and because they are ignorant of the science surrounding GMOs, they just believe them because they sound credible to some extent? Or are there perhaps other aspects here to consider as well?
I think there are multiple reasons. The internet has certainly played a role, but I think as human beings, we have we have evolved naturally to be very suspicious of anything that is different about our food. That's how it has protected us, even during our cave days. When we saw something, if we saw an almond that which we have never eaten before, and those who were careful in what they put into their mouth survived and procreated. You see, so we have that hardwired into our evolutionary system to be suspicious of food, and you can see a lot of examples, like when we started pasteurizing milk, for instance. It was not readily accepted. There were a lot of demonstrations. There was a lot of opposition, because that was messing with, what can be more sacred than milk. And it took almost 100 years after Louis Pasteur invented pasteurization before it was accepted. And a lot of other technologies, the canning of food, freezing of food, processing of food, there have been oppositions, and people don't readily accept. And even when I go to a new country and when I see something different food, I don't, I'm always very cautious about it. You see what I mean? So I think that is humanity. But on the other hand, we humans have experimented with new food. Europe, if for Italy, tomato is so sacred now. What is less Italian than tomatoes? But Italians never ate tomato until 16th century. Irish, the potato is integral to Ireland, but there was no potato in Ireland until again 16th century. You see, coffee was introduced into England, and tea was introduced. they're all new crops, and over time we have learned to accept them if we like it and if we find it useful for us. And so GMOs are, again, when they came along, it was a radical idea for people to think that something foreign genes are being put. But now more and more knowledge, we recognize that such things happen in nature. For instance, they did a study of sweet potatoes. In Peru, there's an international potato center where they have thousands and thousands of varieties of sweet potato. And they found that all the sweet potatoes that they had in the collection had a bacterial gene in them that was introduced directly, like very similar to the same bacteria we use to make GMOs. And so Mother Nature has been making GMOs all the time. And it's just that it happens naturally, and we didn't know much about it. We didn't worry about it. But when we have scientists doing it, we tend to worry about it. But that's one factor. But secondly, true, there was an orchestrated opposition to GMOs in many countries, especially the rich countries, by very well-funded organizations such as Greenpeace, saw this as a very lucrative activity to protest against GMOs because it represented taking on big corporations like Monsanto at the time. And there was a lot of anti-Americanism involved in that in Europe. And so going after big companies like Monsanto was favored. And tabloids did a lot of havoc in the early 2000s with a lot of fake stories about GMOs causing impotence, causes hair loss and things like that. And secondly, European farmers also were afraid of GMOs because, as you know, Europe farmers, like many farmers, are very heavily subsidized. And they felt that if you bring in a tool that improves the productivity, the governments might take the subsidy away from them. Even today, German, French, Belgian farmers are protesting for a different reason, variety of reasons. And so all of that mixed together, I think in Europe was suspicious. And the Green parties held the balance to power in countries like Germany. Also had a platform of anti-GMO, and all of that contributed to the mess that's Europe today.
Do you think that perhaps some of that, when it comes to the European Union, also has to do with some sort of economic protectionism? Because if they make it harder for plants that are GMOs, basically, to come into the EU and be sold here, then they are basically protecting, at least to a certain extent, European farmers, right?
Absolutely, follow the money. Because for any time when there is an apprehension, when there is a protectionism, it's because you're trying to protect something. And then Europe, did that mainly in the beginning. Many of the countries did that to keep some of the American products away. But on the other hand, Europe, when it suits their interest, didn't have any problem because Europe, cheese is so integral to European culture, right? I mean, what is France without your cheese, or German without your cheese? And almost 80%, 90% of all the cheese that's produced in Europe uses recombinant DNA, genetically engineered enzymes. And they are not labeled. People have no problem with them. But there is biotechnology underlying all of your cheese today. And almost every vial of insulin that is sold in Europe today is genetically engineered. And so there's no controversy about that. They're not labeled GMOs, and nobody's protesting on the streets against that. And so the only reason they're protesting against GM crops is because of some of these political factors. Even there, Europe is the largest consumer of GM product in the world because Europe is next to China, imports more soybean, genetically modified soybean, to feed your livestock than any other continent. And so there is a certain level of hypocrisy going on here.
So in a related topic, I would like to ask you now a little bit about organic agriculture. Mm-hmm. That is something that people in the EU and regulators specifically seem to be very fond of.
Yeah.
So This is, of course, a topic that is not only related to agriculture, food production, but also to environmentalism. At least some of the goals here would be environmental goals. So what do you make of the promises of people who support organic agriculture?
Conceptually, it looks like a good idea.
Mhm.
Organic agriculture, why not? Why do we have to, put poisonous chemicals into our food, right? I mean, if it's going to cause so much health problem, if it's destroying our environment, why are we doing it? Why are farmers putting all of those chemicals, right? So on the face of it, when you're not well informed, that's the kind of argument. But the point, the most important fact to remember here is the organic agriculture is a very small niche, ideologically driven segment within agriculture. It represents probably about 2%, 3%, at the most 5% of the food, maybe in countries such as Germany or France, it may be a little bit higher. But overall, organic is an elite segment of the food because it costs more. So so it is not a solution to all the food security issues in the world because you won't be able to feed the poor with organic. And secondly, organic costs more because it is less productive. If you don't if you don't amend the soil fertility of what nutrients you are taking away from that and trying to put that only with using manure and not use synthetic fertilizer, you won't be able to produce a lot of crop. Okay. And so as a consequence of that, it takes a lot more land to grow the same amount of food, correct? So where are you going to get that land? You're going to be cutting down the forests, correct? So which is far more destructive, cutting more forests or adding a little bit of nitrogen into the soil to produce the same amount of food. And so organic, on the just if you're not aware of all the details related to environment and sustainability, sounds like a good idea. But as a food policy issue, organic is a very terrible idea because organic foods cost more. Organic foods take away a lot more land to grow. And finally, they're not anyway more healthier because again and again the evidence show that if you use this very controlled amounts of pesticides and monitor the levels of pesticide residues in your food like we do here in the US, there is it's not as much a problem as it's made out to be. And if we use even fertilizers in a very responsible manner, and with now increasing technology with precision agriculture, we use less and less of those. And finally, with a lot of new technology, including conservation tillage, increasing the use of herbicide-tolerant crops through GMOs or gene editing, we now don't have to till the land. Tilling the land using plows is one of the most destructive acts in agriculture. And when you think of the in the Dust Bowl during the Depression time in the United States, it's because of the plowing of the land where all the soil was blown through the air and water. You see, and when you see the muddied rivers of Mississippi, it's because of the tilling of the land in Iowa and Illinois. Upstream is the very precious organic matter in the soil. So we have now almost eliminated tilling of the land using biotechnology. And so in reality, using science and innovation, we can bring more goodness to the environment than what ideologically driven organic does. In fact, organic agriculture uses a lot of pesticides. Many people don't know that. They use pesticides like sulfur, which is not even organic, and it's a lot more toxic. And so organic is simply a segment of agriculture that people with a lot of money can afford, but it is not something that is going to help feed the world.
Actually, that last point you made there was one thing that I was going to ask you about, because actually it's very misleading the fact that many times people who produce food through organic agriculture and promote it as such label it as chemical free. I mean, of course, just on the face of it, it makes no sense because everything is composed of chemicals. But even if we ignore that bit, it's not at all the case that they do not resort to any pesticides at all, and sometimes even pesticides that are more damaging to the environment and to human health potentially, just because they are labeled as natural by the food system, right?
Certainly, and you said it right, because it's really deceptive marketing practices trying to claim everything is natural. And there have been studies that have been done. There's a very extraordinary scientist called Bruce Ames at UC Berkeley, was one of the most cited scientists for 30 years. And he has done some studies to show that when we consume a cup of coffee, the natural chemicals that are there in the coffee are a lot more toxic than trace elements of pesticides that are used to grow coffee. And so by worrying about that, we are really trying to deny the advance of technology and innovation that could help produce more food. And it can be dangerous too. For instance, recently in Sri Lanka, a couple of years ago, the president of Sri Lanka, based on misinformation and misadvice from some of the environmentalists, including one really vociferous lady from India, banned pesticides, banned fertilizers. And Sri Lanka is an agriculturally very rich country. Sri Lanka grows some of the best quality tea that you consume in the Europe. And Sri Lanka is an agriculturally fairly self-sufficient country. They grow enough rice to feed themselves and even export. And it's a middle-income country, much higher per capita income than its northern neighbor, India, for instance. But by the single act of banning importing fertilizers and banning the use of pesticides, with a decree, Sri Lanka literally precipitated an economic catastrophe to the country. And even 2 years since, they have not fully recovered from the huge reckless damage that was done. And it also reminds me of another very pseudoscientist expert in during Stalin times in USSR and the Soviet Union, a guy called Lysenko. Advised the Stalin that the genetics at the time, we didn't have GMOs, but they were worried about hybrids and genetics. The conventional breeding said that they are somehow antithetical to the communism and they're against communist principles. And so they banned breeding of crops and they banned scientific agriculture. And as a consequence of that, the Russian food production came down, and China later embraced this. Mao embraced that and during the Cultural Revolution. And we didn't know much about that, but a lot of information came out later that literally millions and millions of people died as a consequence of this pseudoscience. And so, organic agriculture or opposition to GMOs might look cute for some, but it has some very serious consequences from when you look from a policy level. Embracing pseudoscience has consequences. And that one, politicians need to be very careful about it, especially in Europe, because there is a lot more tendency to have these romantic notions about these things in Europe more than other places. And you need to be very careful about that.
When it comes to Lysenko, if I remember correctly, and if not, please correct me here, I think that he was sort of an extreme environmentalist and didn't really care much or at all about genetics, and so that was the main issue here, right? I mean, he was trying to cultivate crops while at the same time ignoring entirely the genetic side of things there. Right.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. His philosophy was we can shape the crops, improve the crops by environment, by like slowly growing some crops acclimatizing them. Say, let's say you want to make them more tolerant to heat or tolerant to cold, we can gradually expose them to cold or heat, and we can make any crop adaptable to these conditions. And there may be a certain truth to that with some epigenetics and things like that. But nevertheless, what he did was he used that very pseudo scientific basis of that vernalization and things of that nature, they're called in science, to literally ban genetics, ban conventional hybridization. And so much so that there was a great, extraordinary scientist called Vavilov in Soviet Union at the time. He is literally the father of biodiversity. He is the one who helped identify that all our crop plots have an origin in some places, and they came, and then if you go back to the centers of origin, you can find even today a great diversity of wild species. Like potato, you can find it in Peru, right? And if you want to find relatives of coffee, you go to Ethiopia. If you want to find relatives of rice, you go to Asia, things like that. He was the one who first identified that all crop plants have their origin, and you go to their origin, and he collected all those wild and heirlooms, literally hundreds of thousands of that, and made the concept of gene bank, which is fundamental to all agricultural development. And what Lysenko and Stalin did was to literally put Vavilov and all scientists who were working on breeding into jail. And the father of biodiversity and father of agricultural innovation of 20th century died of starvation in Gulag in Russia. And so this is one of the sad stories that we have learned from our history. And you know what they say about the history: if you ignore history, what happens? And the ugly head of that opposition to science keeps coming again and again and again in different forms, and one needs to be very careful about it. Dr. Norman Borlaug, the father of Green Revolution, and used to warn many times again as to some of these pseudo, they are not environmentalists. You know, we are all we are the environmentalists because we know what is environment. We live with that, and these are pseudo environmentalists. They are using environment as an excuse or a guise to advance their specific ideological causes, or even for fundraising and their own prosperity.
So we'll come back to that point about environmentalists in a second, but let me just ask you a little bit more about Sri Lanka, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, because this is actually something that was brought to my attention by a supporter, a patron of the show, Bernardo Seixas. And if I understand it correctly, in Sri Lanka, then they already had an economic crisis, but then it got worsened by the government basically banning pesticides and adopting an agricultural system solely based on organic agriculture, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, no, Sri Lanka, because of the COVID and their very high reliance on tourism, was already in bad shape at the time. But so were many countries. You know, there are so many countries that are rely on tourism as the main economic source of income. Dozens and dozens of countries in the world. They didn't go bankrupt, and they were able to sustain. And Sri Lanka is economically had very sound economic underpinnings. And because it was also an agricultural country, and by taking this very reckless decision to go organic overnight, you know, if they wanted to embrace principles of organics, reduce environmental degradation through overt use of chemicals, is an admirable goal. And because we understand that in places like India, there has been some problems in use of agri-chemicals. And so that is a legitimate issue that needs to be addressed. But by taking a reckless decision and going organic overnight, I think he precipitated the economic downfall of Sri Lanka. And so there were street protests, and the president had to resign. And 2 months into that, Sri Lanka is still not fully recovered. from the problem. So that shows that one needs to be very careful about taking important policy decisions that are not based on science, that are not based on reason. But if you just listen to some of these pseudo activists and pseudo environmentalists, you bring a huge damage to your country.
So let's get into the last topic of our conversation today then. That is something you've already touched a little bit on, but what are your general thoughts on environmentalism as a movement and on people who sometimes are genuine environmental activists, but other times perhaps label themselves as such, but are maybe ignorant or delusional or misled in some particular ways?
Right. I think environmentalism, in a very broad sense, is an important movement that has brought a lot of good, especially when you look at global climate change, which is an important factor. It is really transform. It's an existential threat to the world civilization today. And I believe in understanding and awareness of that. And it's a very scientific issue. We need to be aware of what causes this and how we can do it and what are some of the solutions for that. And so it's a very science-based approach that we need to have to solve that. But on the other hand, what has happened here is the so-called the environmentalists who are causing damage are those that simply bring pseudoscience and ideology into the mix here. And so this is where it's a problem for us, especially for a common person, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to recognize what are some of the most pressing issues, the wicked problems that are threatening the future of humanity today here, then see what solutions that we can move forward. What has unfortunately happened here is individuals who are in the forefront in the minds of the public, who are seen as very pro-environment, are doing a lot more damage to the progress of the society. And people like Vandana Shiva in India is the one who advised Sri Lankan government, along with some of the other scientists like Hans Herren, who was a World Food Prize winner, did far more great damage. Lysenko was a scientist. He was a geneticist, but he simply misled the country. There is a very famous scientist here in the U.S. called Duisberg in UC Berkeley, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and he was of the opinion, he's a member of National Academy of Sciences too, which is the highest honor a scientist can get here in the US, of the opinion that HIV virus does not cause AIDS. And in South African government believed him, and as a consequence of that, they banned all the therapeutic proteinase inhibitors and things of that AIDS cocktail that has really kept AIDS in check all around the world in the last 30 years. They banned, and as a consequence of embracing that pseudoscience and pseudo stalwarts like this, about 300,000 people died in Sri Lanka. I'm sorry, in South Africa, because of the AIDS drugs were not allowed into the country. And so one must be very wary of individuals that have a vested interest in advancing certain causes. But on the other hand, we do have to understand that the scientific voice, such as IPCC, for instance, coming up for the global climate change, and also to listen to the established scientists and the scientific community to see what kind of solutions that we can embrace in a way that we could bring about addressing these solutions, bring about the solutions to addressing the problems in a manner that is not ideologically driven, but fairly science driven.
Mm-hmm. Right. And this is very unfortunate. And this will be my last question also, because I guess that many times what some environmentalists put out as information is in fact misinformation. It is very misleading. And unfortunately, the general public, and this is something that we can't really blame the common people for because they are not informed about such matters. It sounds good, it sounds intuitive, but it is misleading, and it not only applies to agriculture, to, for example, misconceptions surrounding organic agriculture, GMOs, but also even more broadly to some of the solutions, the best solutions that we would have on the table to fight back against climate change. Right.
Exactly. Climate change and even health. You see, when there was a global pandemic, there was quite a lot of opposition to the vaccines. And it was at the end of the day, it was the vaccine and a very new innovation, untested innovation, mRNA vaccine, that helped really bring about an end to that. And so I believe we must be open-minded about many of the possibilities of innovation, including how we address climate change. And if we invoke precautionary principle that until we know for sure this particular solution is very, very safe, that we cannot use it, then we cannot move forward, because humanity has moved forward the last 2,000, 5,000 years by embracing change, but by embracing change in a very informed manner. And now, with our knowledge in the last 100 years, even last 30 years, we have an explosion of knowledge, because the science has advanced so much, whether it's in the areas of health, whether it's in the area of agriculture or climate change. And so let's use our knowledge in a sensible manner to bring about a change without necessarily have to bringing about any problems as a consequence of that.
So, Dr. Prakash, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. If you are on Twitter, if you look for Ag Bio World, that is my handle. I used to run a website called Ag Bio World. Ag is in agriculture, biotechnology, or biology, and world. If you look for Ag Bio World either on Facebook or Twitter, you will find me every day talking about these issues, posting funny memes on this issue, and trying the hope that we could help educate, and also learning. I'm learning every day from smart people like you, Ricardo.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words, Dr. Prakash, and thank you for your time. And it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I've been a big fan, so thank you so much.
Thank you. Honor is mine, and the pleasure.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Costa, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.